Federal judge striking down the FTC's regulation on non-compete agreements that was set to go into effect in early September. Join us right now to talk about the impact on the ruling on this situation is Joanne Lipman, Yale University lecturer and a CNBC contributor. Good morning. Expected, not expected in your mind?
Not at all unexpected, I would say, Andrew. I think what's really interesting here is how we're seeing how it's going to play out, assuming that this ruling stands. If you look at who's going to be impacted versus who's not going to be impacted, and the people who actually will be impacted the most, it appears, would be those who are in low-income jobs, lower-income jobs, hourly wage jobs. The people at the very, very highest end of the spectrum, they're really not going to be impacted by this probably at all, because there was already a carve-out with that FTC ruling that they were allowed to have non-competes for that group of people. So it's really interesting. The younger people, are the lower income people, increasingly, this is what's been interesting, and this is probably one of the things that was an impetus for the FTC, is there's been this expansion, sort of a non-compete creep, where you see more lower income people, even hourly people, people who work in fast food or hairdressers, people who work in retail stores, who have increasingly been subject to non-compete agreements. And you know, the FTC has suggested that something like 30 million American workers, that's 1 in 5 American workers, has now been subject to these non-compete clauses. And there's other research, economic research, that shows you that something like 12% of workers who make less than $20,000 a year have been subject to these non-competes. 15% of people who don't even have college degrees subject to these non-competes.
So, Joanne, what comes next? And I think the larger question is, I mean, I think it's raised to some degree by the judge. Should this be something the FTC is doing unilaterally, if you will, which obviously the judge disagrees with and thinks is not constitutional? Or is this something that Congress and the Senate need to be writing laws about?
All right. So I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not going to make any suggestions along those lines. But I would say that there's already a lot of state legislation that applies to non-compete agreements. There's several states, including California, we're home of Silicon Valley, where non-compete agreements are already banned. And that doesn't impact the FTC. I know the argument was that this was overreach by the FTC, but, you know, there's a lot of state law that's already around this. And also,
the question is, should this be a federal issue? I mean, that's the fundamental question here. Is it a federal issue? Should it be up to the states? You know, states can write their own laws, but the federal government can't just write its own law unless everybody writes the law, as opposed to an agency determining the law, right? That's what the judge effectively is saying.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's one that could ultimately be answered by the Supreme Court, right? This could actually end up going all the way up. I think another interesting question is...
Well, by the way, Joanne, if it goes all the way up, I think we know where it ends. There will not be a ban on non-competes on a federal level, no?
Well, I think that the question then becomes, if you can't have it on the federal level, will there then be challenges at the state level? Because there are increasing numbers of crackdowns among the states. There were 3 that banned it altogether, but there's another half dozen or so that have been increasingly, putting in restrictions on non-competes.
Let me ask you a semi-political question. What do you think this says about the FTC, and what does this say about the Biden administration's approach to governing, if you will?
Well, I think that the FTC ruling was very, very much in keeping with everything else we have seen from the Biden administration in terms of how it's approaching business, right? It's very much in keeping. I don't think there's any surprise there. I also don't think there's any surprise in a Texas judge banning it, making that ruling. So I don't think we see any surprises there. I think, the question will be what's the world going to look like in the next administration, and who will take the reins there. Obviously, there's kind of 2 competing views of where the federal government stands with these non-competes. But I do want to make the point, Andrew, that for higher income people, for people who are already in leadership, none of this really makes a difference, because in the FTC ruling, if it were to stand, the FTC, I think very few people were focused on this. It actually had a carve out. It had a carve out for top executives who had policy-making decisions, and they only had to make something like 151,000 or so or more. So there were a lot of people who already, were carved out. We're still subject to non-competes. And again, you have all these state laws where, they also were legislating what you could do with a non-compete.